Gene, yeah. So anyway, but one thing that's happened this year is, and I'm going to sit down for this. The terms of offices for officers are up. So we've developed within our bylaws a scheme for keeping things going, but it does require that we get a new president, a new vice president, and a secretary and treasurer, and these are per our bylaws. Beyond that, we've developed some coordinator positions, excuse my English, or partial English, whatever it was. One is a communications coordinator. Pat Esselman has agreed to take that on. That's what John's been doing a lot of for the last, I don't know how many years. And so he's training Pat on how to take care of that. Another one is a membership coordinator. John is, you're going to take on that, right?
I'll take on whatever.
Yeah.
We need. You can't get rid of me.
All right. We've tried, but we can't. The next one is youth diversity and education coordinator. We have Linda. You've been involved with this. We're kind of hoping that you step up to that. Hint, hint. Nudge, nudge. Presentation and events coordinator. In the past, this has always been kind of one of the president's duties, but we want to try to get more people involved and train more people to be involved with this. And what that would involve mostly is like if we have like a chapter meeting, you would go out and find the speakers, work with them to see what they're going to present to us, and then show up at the event and make it happen. I've been doing that, I don't know how many years now. So
Just a word on that. Actually, that's not a real difficult job, because
no, it's the first in the summer. Sometime you get a hold of the speakers. You look at the calendar. We do things here at Scotty's. We've always been here. We like it. They're a trout friendly group. So cold water preservation is part of their thing they want to do. So we like it here. It's a good atmosphere. So we'll probably keep that going. But it's more or less finding the speakers. I know the first time I did it, I think Linda and John and a few other people helped me because I said, hey, I don't know as many people as you guys do. So they at least got me the contacts, and I found out it was actually pretty easy to do. So that's what that involves. The next one is a stream project and workday coordinator. I'm going to take that on. I have a lot of contacts within the DNR, and all our workdays and stream projects have to involve them anyway. So the next one is a fundraising coordinator. And then beyond the membership, I guess I didn't mention this, but the secretary treasurer also has to have a financial reviewer. And this is just somebody who's not on the board, but is willing to look at the books each month to make sure nobody's running away with the money.
you don't even look at the books. It's basically you get the bank statement, and you make sure that the treasurer hasn't purchased a new Winston fly rod.
Yeah.
Yeah. That kind of stuff.
So
something that looks shady, then you got to report it back.
So that's really what we have to do. I mean, it's in our bylaws. The terms are what they are, and so we need people to step up to these positions and volunteer to be a part of it. I mean, if you look at the treasurer's duties, if we showed them up here, we're not going to do that right now. It's the longest list, but it's actually not a real time-consuming duty. It's there's a couple reports, one to national for hours and stuff people use or do for us, and then the other one is just a tax thing, which is actually the national's got the forms for you to fill out and stuff. So I mean, beyond that, it's occasionally you get to write a check to give to somebody. So but anyway, that's what we need to do. So we are hoping somebody's willing to step up, or at least propose somebody to step up. And hopefully they're willing to take on those positions. And, as always, I mean, I'll be outgoing, but if somebody steps into the role of president and vice president, John and I will be there to bounce things off of or ask questions. So, but it does have to happen, and it has to happen in May, basically. So.
Just a couple touch on a couple of things. With the fundraising coordinator, basically, we've had one very successful F3T film tour. We haven't been doing banquets and that, so that's alleviated a lot of the running around trying to get, donations and that kind of stuff. So that's pretty much it, unless somebody wants to come up with wants to come up with other ideas as fundraising. I guess that's about it.
So anyway,
The youth and diversity thing, we're looking to, as you look around, thank you, Linda, for being here tonight, but most of the time we're old white guys in earth tones, that get, as part of of any TU chapter. So we're trying to look at and be somewhat purposeful about trying to get some youth and some diversity, both ethnic and gender on our boards and what we're doing. So.
Definitely, we're not looking to tell the old white guys with beards we don't want you, but we are looking to tell other people we do want you to come aboard. We want your thoughts, your process to help us out. We want to continue to grow. We've had very substantial growth in the last 2 years. It's the rest of the state had this was a year and a half ago when we were deep in COVID. They averaged on a state about 33% growth. Our chapter was, as a percentage, the largest percent with growth. We grew by 55% at that time, and we're now over 300 members. Yeah, something like that. So anyway, so we've had some good growth, and we want to get those people out there. And I've always believed that part of this chapter, what we need to do is ask less of what we want from our members, but do things for them. Give them work days, give them things they can get involved with, give them things that they can see the good things that we do. And then, hopefully the money that we need comes along with that. But financially, we are stable. So we're good that way. So that being said, if anybody wants more questions or whatever answered, you can get a hold of me. We sent out an email to everybody with my contact information on. You can probably even submit an email to our website, which will come to me anyway. So, and we'd be happy to talk to you about it. So. With that said, Henry.
Oh, we got a work day coming up.
Oh, yeah. Linda talked about that. Oh, you talked about, the work day, May 21st. We're going to plant about 2,000 trees on the Prairie River. So.
That'll be sent out. If you're getting the emails, you'll get notice of it.
Yep. We'll be under the guidance of Taylor Cron from the DNR, but we will need a lot of volunteers for it. I would imagine that we might get some from the Green Bay chapter and maybe even a few people from Northwoods. So we will be looking forward to seeing as many of you out there as possible. We will this year, because we didn't when we did this a couple of years ago, we will this year provide like hamburgers, hot dogs out there, that type of thing. So you at least get some payback for your work. What?
Yes.
Well, you should have brought cookies tonight, Linda. We're not through with it. Everything just got put on hold. What's that?
high school kids coming out.
No, that'll probably happen next year, I imagine.
Next fall. We'll see.
I don't think they're gonna get rid of that. I believe, from what I understood from the last email I saw, the teachers still want to do it. It's a matter of, we can't be in a situation where, you know, we have a pandemic issue. So, yep. I thought you were talking about the project on the Plover River that we started to talk about with the DNR and the village of Hatley 3 years ago, is just on hold. It still may happen. Actually, the fisheries biologists and the manager have talked to us about maybe getting and doing a tour with some of the stuff this spring. So I have to get back in contact with him and see when they want to do it, because they definitely talked about doing it. So, and I know Tim Parks has left for Madison, but the new guy is somebody who grew up in the area, and he was here the last meeting, and he's excited about a lot of these opportunities. So we need to keep that strong presence with them. So, anybody got anything else they want to mention or bring up? Okay, Henry, you can clip that on.
Before you start, will you run out and take this,
Oh, I'll tell them to spit on your food. How's that? Okay. How's the volume? All right.
You're just going to have to wait for me when you read the paper.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead and just go to the first slide. Can you just? No, the first slide. Are you able just to, or do you have to keep the whole thing up?
It's not letting me change that.
It's not letting you change it. Okay.
I thought I could just do the full screen on this. Maybe I can't. Hold on. Nope. Oh, there we go.
Oh, okay. All right. So the talk tonight is about selectivity and understanding the biologic basis of it and how we can apply it to trout populations. So go ahead, next slide. Okay, so this is kind of how I got involved in this, to try to figure out, you know, what was really going on. And Poindexter Slough, I don't know if any of you have fished it. It's outside of Dillon, Montana, and it's a true spring creek, and it's one of the few public spring creeks in Montana. So if you go to Dillon, Poindexter just comes out of a spring, and it's about 2 miles long. It's surrounded by grass and like prairie. Yeah, like pasture. So I was walking along the stream and I saw this brown trout, and the field was just full of grasshoppers. So I have this sampling net, and I caught 3 grasshoppers. The local fly shops, they have 3 fly shops in Dillon, Montana, and they were selling Joe's hopper, Whitlock's hopper, and Schrader's parachute hoppers. So I had all 3 of those patterns. And so I thought, well, you know, this fly shop is selling these patterns, so they must work. So I got behind this trout, and I put on a Joe's hopper. He totally ignored it. Put on a Whitlock hopper, totally ignored it. Put on a Schrader's parachute hopper, totally ignored it. So I thought, what the heck's going on? So I got back out of the stream. I caught 3 grasshoppers, and I crippled them by just messing up their wings. And I threw it out there, and the trout came by, looked at the real grasshopper, and refused it. Refused the second real hopper, refused the third hopper. So that, you know, so I'm really puzzled. So I thought, what's going on? I don't understand why that would be. The second I'll talk about later was a heavy blue-winged olive hatch. And these trout were feeding on the blue-winged olives, but they were refusing all the flies, including a very realistic pattern that I tie. So I tried to figure out why and how were these things happening. Next slide. So we'll talk about the mind of a trout. So is a trout an unthinking animal that just is instinctive, or can a trout learn from its successes and failures? And specifically, I want to know if selectivity is something that a trout learns. Is it a learned behavior? And if it is a learned behavior, how does it happen? Next slide. So here we have, I think you guys might have seen this, but this window is 93 degrees. And that's the window of the trout. It can see an angle of 93 degrees. And within that 93 degrees, the whole 180 degrees is squeezed into that window. From here to here is seen in that 93 degrees. So what the trout does when it feeds on a dry fly is it uses the edge of the window as a gun sight. So it's looking, and when the mayfly is there, all it sees is the wing. It can see the imprint of the feet, because it can see the feet, and then the light comes in and it sees kind of a speckled pattern. So it sees the imprint of the mayfly's feet, but it can't really see the mayfly. It starts seeing the tip of the wing, then it sees more of the wing, and then it sees the entire mayfly. And what the trout does, and when it rises, it comes up and it uses the edge of the window as a gun sight. And it knows exactly where its mouth is and where the mouth should be in order to intercept this insect. So it comes up and it gets it. And trout do not miss your fly. I've heard people say, well, the trout missed my fly, when they were dry fly fishing. They don't miss the fly. What happened is that's called a late refusal, where the trout is coming up, and as it gets closer, it sees better. The trout's eyesight is really bad. It's 1/12 of the human eyesight. And that's comparable to a human's eyesight compared to an eagle's eyesight. Now, an eagle can be up there a quarter of a mile flying around, and it can see a mouse on the ground and come down and get it, or a rabbit. And so the trout have really poor eyesight, and it's a good thing, because otherwise we'd never be able to fool it with our fly, making it think that it's a real insect. Next slide. Okay. A simple rise is when so these are rise forms. A simple rise is when a trout comes up and it intercepts the fly, just come back up and intercepts it. And that's what that original previous slide was showing. A compound rise is when it comes up and it is following the fly, and it gets vertical in the water, and it takes the fly or the insect. A complex rise is when it comes up and it follows the fly, and it's actually facing downstream when it takes the fly. And what it's doing is it is inspecting and trying to decide whether this is something real or whether it's something fake. Okay? And if you've never seen these, and in Wisconsin, I've got to tell you, it's difficult for you to come up against these circumstances. But when you fish out west and you fish in a real spring creek, or you fish in a tailwater fishery, where these fish are pounded day after day after day, you'll see this type of behavior when you're fishing. And then I've seen trout come by. They will go to this position. They will refuse the fly, and then they will turn back and take it. What's going on there? I have no idea why they would refuse it and then come back and take the fly. It just like is yes.
Are you more likely to see that simple rise than a smaller, younger trout?
Yeah, I think so. As trout get well, we'll talk about that. But as trout get more experienced, I think there is some kind of learning going on. But we'll talk about the difference between older big trout and small trout in terms of their feeding behavior. Next slide. Okay. So we're going to get into the psychology of a trout. So the definition of learning is a long-term change in behavior that is based on experience. And as we get deeper into this discussion, we're going to see that we as humans exhibit the same kind of learning behavior that trout do. And that what the way a trout, quote, learns is essentially the same way that a young child learns. And that this process extends through the entire animal kingdom. Okay, so what we learn here of the psychology of a trout, actually you could say is the psychology of a human, is the psychology of a dog, is the psychology of a cat. Next slide. So what is selectivity? Why does it occur? How does it occur? Is it a voluntary process? Or is it something that the trout can't help himself? Does it apply equally to all trout? How does it explain fly fatigue, which fly fatigue is a process where, do you remember several years ago, there was a fly called the purple haze? You guys remember that? It was like a parachute Adams, only had a purple body, and it was really, really popular. And, there are articles written about it, and people were catching all kinds of trout on the purple haze. And then after a year, purple haze was like gone, right? So we're going to try to see how does fly fatigue happen. And then finally, I'm going to discuss what we are actually doing when we're fly fishing. What are we really doing? Next slide. Okay, Garyborger was a teacher at the Marathon campus here, and he made the first fly fishing videos for 3M. Well-known fly fisher, wrote several books. So this is his definition of selectivity. The concept of selectivity is an easy one to understand. There's a really, really high concentration of one type of food. Fish are feeding on that organism and shun all others. In other words, they ignore everything else. This allows the fish to target a known food item and thereby maximize food intake and minimize energy expenditure. So we're going to get a little bit into this a little bit later, but I guess I'll mention it now. As trout get bigger, the thing we got to realize is when a trout feeds on one mayfly, it gets this little bit of food, right? A fraction of a calorie. A 4-ounce trout gets the same amount of food feeding on that mayfly as a as a 4-pound trout does. But a 4-pound trout has to move 16 times, has to move four 16 times the mass. So it does more work, spends more calories to get the same amount of food. Okay? So big trout have to be very, very careful, not really careful, but have to feed more efficiently, because if they don't, they starve to death, right? They don't get big by chasing around and picking food nilly-willy and you know, going here and seeing if that's food and going there and seeing if that's food, you know. Yeah.
Does this explain why a larger trout is in the better feeding lane?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's one of, because they pick the prime lies, right? Everybody here know what a prime lie is, right? You know what a prime lie is? Prime lie? Prime lie. Yeah, okay, I'll explain it. A lie is where a fish is. Now, there are things called sheltering lies, where a fish stays there and it feels like it's safe. So it could be in deep water. It could be underneath an overhanging tree, okay? So it stays there and it's its resting spot. A prime lie is a sheltering lie where it can eat. It has both safety and food. And big fish are in the prime lies because they push every other fish away. You know, this is my house, right? This is where I am and this is where I eat. So when you're looking for places to fish, I think we naturally do that, right? We look where the best places to fish are going to be, and the best place in the river are the prime lies. Safety and food together. The prime lie in any stream, and this goes for all trout waters, like a riffle. All of a riffle is a prime lie, as long as it's knee deep or less in depth, because it has a lot of light, which means there's a lot of vegetation. Light is the source of energy. It means there's more vegetation, there's more insects on the bottom. It's got a lot of oxygen, so it can just sit there on the bottom, and it only has to come up maybe 2.5 feet to feed on the surface. So all of a riffle is a prime lie. That's the first place, if you're a beginning fly fisher, you want to go there, and that's the place you want to fish. Next.
Also, it's most likely the place you're going to lose your fly.
If you're nymphing. Yeah, okay. Next slide. So we had Garyborger, his quote, okay, the definition to understand selectivity, but do we really understand how and why selectivity develops? So this is my goal, to try to explain how and why selectivity develops, and how this process explains why we see the weird kind of trout behaviors that we sometimes see. Next slide. Okay. Now, trout, it's not like that trout turn on a switch and they go from feeding opportunistically. Opportunistic feeding, I should probably define that too. Trout, they have no hands, right? They can't look at something, pick it up, and see if it's food. The way they tell whether something is food is to take it in their mouth. Whether it's a leaf, you know, or a little bit of moss that's floating in the water, they do what's called sampling the drift. They sample the things that are coming by them in the water. selectivity is trout feed on a single stage of a hatch. They're feeding on one item. Okay? Super selectivity, and I've only seen this once, is when trout feed on only a subset of a single stage of a hatch. And I'll describe why I coined that term. Next slide. Okay, everybody's heard of size, shape, color, behavior, right? Everybody knows that we want to imitate the size of the natural, the shape of the natural, the color of the natural, and the behavior of the natural. Whether the behavior is dead drift, or if it's an emerger, it's coming up, and we do the lasering lift to make the fly come up. So that's common knowledge, and it's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to talk really about matching the hatch and imitating the size, shape, color, behavior. If learning is a change in behavior based on experience, how does this occur in trout? In other words, how do trout learn if that's what they're doing? Next slide. Okay, the common logical explanation is that this is all evolution. A trout feeding selectively, it's feeding selectively on a small item, ignores a larger possible food item because it must move to take it. So if it's in a location and it's feeding, and then something bigger comes by, why will it not come and take this item? Is there a reason why it doesn't? The reason is that motion will waste energy if that item is not food. In other words, it has to come over and see and actually take it in its mouth to discover it's not food. So selectivity is the most food for the least effort. Therefore, selectivity is an evolved behavior. So evolution favors selectivity. In order to pass on your genes, a trout has to live long enough to spawn. And if it doesn't live long enough to spawn, become an adult, it can't pass its genes on. So gradually through evolution, select trout that become selective have survived. Okay, it's not like trout all of a sudden came to be and all the trout were selective. This is an evolutionary process. So, but any explanation of selectivity must also explain what we as humans would consider to be illogical behavior, where selective feeding trout would also ignore a larger food item, a grasshopper, that it does not need to move to take. And that trout, instead, the trout continues to feed on very small blue-winged olive mayflies when a grasshopper comes by right in that same stream. This is the opposite of the most food for the least effort. So why would evolution favor this behavior? Okay, next slide. Okay, selectivity is a form of conditioning. And so I'm going to take you a little bit into psychology. And all of you, and conditioning is a form of behavior modification. And that's what learning is. We're modifying our behavior. And kids learn not to put their hands on a hot stove. They do that once and they won't do it again. And that's a painful learning behavior. So with Pavlov's dog, which is, when we think about conditioning, we think about Pavlov's experiment. So the Pavlov rang a dinner bell, then fed the dog every time that it was fed. And then after it was conditioned to the ringing of the bell, he rang the bell and the dog salivated. Okay, even though there was no food. So anybody that's taken a course in psychology, has read about and heard about this Pavlov's experiment. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So selectivity is a conditioned response. It's not a specific evolutionary adaptation. Now, classical conditioning is Pavlov's dog. This is what's called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is where your behavior is modified, either reinforced or you avoid the behavior by the consequences of that behavior. Okay? So it is a type of learning. So when a dog trainer, you've seen, these the Westminster Dog Show, and each time the dog does the right thing, they give the dog like a doggy treat. So that's training with food is reinforcement. So classical conditioning is reflex. Operant conditioning is you modify their voluntary behavior so that it becomes involuntary. At first, the behavior was voluntary. You condition it enough, it becomes involuntary. Okay, I should discuss this now. Any of you know what tinyurl.com is? Any of you? Okay. There is a link, http tinyurl.com, and if you write this down, and then each time there's a link, you just write down PMSYWW5. If you go to this page, it will take you to several TED Talks about conditioning. So you'll see this tiny URL on several of the slides, and all you got to do is write this down if you want to go to a link that discusses all of this in more detail. Next slide. So operant conditioning is a feedback loop, basically. You have a stimulus, you have a response, and then you reinforce that response. And then same stimulus, response, reinforce the response. Next slide. Okay, so there's a TED Talk on a parrot that they trained to be an art critic. Okay? So what they did with this parrot is two paintings. Okay? They had a painting by Monet, and then they had a painting by Picasso. And when the parrot clicked the painting by Monet, it would get fed. Okay? Painting by Monet, get fed. Then they put a different impressionistic painting up there and a different cubist kind of painting by Picasso. Parrot had never seen the Monet painting, had never seen the Picasso painting. It picked the Monet painting. Totally different painting. Same artist, different paintings. And the point being is that the parrot came to like impressionist paintings, and it seemed as if the parrot had a high level of intelligence because it could tell, a Monet from a Picasso. Is that Monet? Oh, Van Gogh, sorry. All right,
Goes self-perfect.
yeah, okay, sorry. I should have put a Monet up there. Yeah, okay, look, go to the next,
What about bottom list?
I think that's gotta be the Picasso, right? Yeah,
He had a lot of different things.
next painting. Okay, so that's so we got operant conditioning has two limbs, right? There's reinforcement and there's punishment. Next slide. So, oh no, go back. Okay, so this is the reinforcement side. We talked about that. Food, it's a positive stimulus, and the behavior increases, and that's selectivity. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. Food, selectivity. Next slide. Okay. Now here's the other limb. Okay. So we're fly fishing for the trout. It comes and it takes our fly. It gets dragged around for a while. We bring it in, we release it. So this is called positive punishment. The trout gets punished for taking our fly. Okay? Here it gets food. Here it gets punished. Yes?
So if we didn't practice catch and release, would a trout never learn?
Right, it would die, right?
This is much like the punishment side, reminds me of being a young Catholic kid.
What, ruler?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Next slide. So there are two limbs to operant conditioning, right? And then gradually, you know, the trout learns what the fly looks like after it's been caught a number of times, and it refuses to take that fly. Next slide. So selectivity for food, refusal for fly. Next slide.
So I have another question, Henry.
Yeah.
So, in theory, if it's selective genetics, would a fish that's never seen a particular fly refuse it? You know, if it was from parents that had learned not to take that fly?
Okay, how would it learn from parents?
I don't know, but it's been
Okay, we're gonna actually, you raise an interesting point because we're gonna talk about this, and it is a relatively brand new discovery in, like, you use genetics, right? There is a thing called epigenetics, and we're going to talk about that. Have any of you heard the term epigenetics? EPI in front of genetics. Okay, good. So we're gonna talk exactly about the point that you raised.
But fish, unlike a lot of other animals,
Right?
their parents don't teach them anything.
Right.
If you watch a young eagle,
Right.
I've seen where the mother
Right.
and father will teach it how to
Right.
fish.
We're going
Fish,
to,
once they start to grow, the parents are no longer
Right.
part of their life.
but we're gonna talk about epigenetics, and epigenetics is a theoretical way that adult fish can pass on their knowledge to their young. Now think about that an adult fish could theoretically pass on its knowledge. And in terms of, I was going to say this till later, but in terms of human biology, when we talk about, our children, people might say, oh gosh, your son behaves just like you did when you were a kid, or you know what I'm saying? and he just got in the same kind of trouble or whatever it may be, you know, as your father or as your mother or whatever. Okay. So operant condition explains how trout learn to become selective to a hatch through repeated positive reinforcement, how trout can learn to associate drag with a bad result through positive punishment, that other side, and how a trout gradually learns to avoid a hot fly as the season progresses via positive punishment, right? Because you'll have like the purple haze works great one season, and then gradually it stops working anymore. How do we explain how that happens, right? How do we explain that? Next slide. Okay, now there's a process called extinction. Extinction is observed when both operant condition and classically conditioned behavior, when operant behavior that has previously been reinforced no longer produces the reinforcing consequences, and the behavior gradually stops occurring. Okay, now an example of this is the salmon fly, or actually any hatch, where you're in a situation where, particularly with salmon flies, because the hatch progresses up to Madison, and they hatch all at once in this one location. If you've ever been on the salmon fly, now so when the salmon fly are around, they actually crawl up. The nymphs crawl up and they actually hatch on rocks. They don't hatch in the river. So the trout never, feed on the emerging insect like they do with mayflies. But then the salmon flies come back, and when they're mating and on the water, that's when the trout see them. But after they mated, they're gone, they're dead. And yet trout will continue to feed on the salmon fly imitation after the hatch is passed, and that gradually that fly stops working. And that's what's called extinction. That behavior gradually goes away because it's no longer being reinforced with food, right? By eating food. Next slide. Okay, so this is how already in the, so we went to the salmon fly. Go. Next slide. Okay. Fish memories and conditioning. So this is various links that talk about how fish, like a trout has Garyborger says has a trout IQ of 6, right? And how even with an IQ of 6, that it can flummox us. Now when we talk about we'll go ahead. Next slide. So what happened here was they wouldn't take a Jones hopper, a Whitlock's hopper, Schrader's hopper, and 3 real hoppers. And the only reason I'm wondering whether somebody, on Poindexter had put a bear hook or a fly and put a real hopper on it and threw it in there and caught this trout, because it definitely avoided real grasshoppers. So what I did was I put on a Henry's fork hopper, which is different from all of these things, and the trout came over right away and took a Henry's fork hopper. So I just switched it up. I used the hopper fly, but with a different appearance. So this situation here is where I was fishing the the San Juan River, and have any of you fished the San Juan? Okay. Can be extremely selective trout. So I have this fly that's called a hackled no hackle, which is kind of a, it's a negative really. And any of you know what a Swisher and Richards no hackle fly is? You know, any of the others. Okay. Swisher and Richards, they came up with this fly that is the most realistic dun pattern. It has, you have to, and it is crazy difficult to tie. Very, very difficult. I can't do it. I tried. You have to get 2 matching duck or goose quills from the same bird, from the same part of the opposite wings, so that they're mirror images. Then you take the slip from the same part of the matching feathers, and you tie a fly with those slips, and they look like a mayfly. Yes.
You told us earlier, trout can't see worth the dark. How can they tell if you got matching mirror patterns?
Well,
cross-examining him.
yeah. Well, when they're, yeah, right. No, you're right.
Objection!
But no, but when they're selective, they look for everything. Like if you get a traditionally hackled fly, that looks nothing like, right? The traditional palmered hackle, it looks nothing like a real fly. But when you get these really selective trout, they're looking, and they're really looking close. So the closer they get to the fly, the better they can see, right? And then they follow it, and they're looking for drag, but they're looking for any kind of difference. So if you have, this fly has matching wings, and it looks really like a real mayfly. The problem is, unless you get those wings exactly the same, when you cast, these are like airfoils. The fly spins.
They died in an instant.
The fly spins in the air. It's impossible for me to get. So what I did was I did a hackled no hackle, where I put a couple of turns of hackle in front to break up the airflow, so then I could cast it, and it wouldn't spin. And what I would do is I would cut the hackle on the bottom so that it would lie flat, and it would still have this wing profile, but just a couple of hackle loops in front of it so that it wouldn't spin. So you got to buy 2 wings. If somebody shoots a duck, and you ask them to cut the wings off and give them to you, or a goose, and then you have to just, then the wings have to come from the same bird, and then you take the quills. Yeah, but so anyway, so I'm fishing on a San Juan with a friend, and he says, come over here. So I'm looking, and if this is the rock, they're coming to a rock, and we're standing here, and the trout are rising right where you are, right? They're not afraid of if they don't feed when there's fishermen around, they won't feed. So the trout's coming by, and he's trying every fly in his box, and I said, okay, let's try this fly. So I cut the wings flat, give it to him, and he catches 3 fish. And he says, your fly's not working anymore. So I look at it, it looks good. So then, I said, well, let's get closer. Let's really look at these fish. So we're looking at the fish, and the perfect duns come down, the fish ignores it. Perfect dun comes down, the fish ignores it. A dun comes down with one wing tilted to one side. It takes it. Comes down with the wing tilted to one side. It can be either side, but tilted. It takes it. So the situation is that the hatch is so heavy that, and these fish get so fished over that it avoids, it got caught, you know, when it took a fly that looked like and imitated the perfect one. So it took what essentially is kind of like a cripple, right, with one wing down. So I get another fly and I cut it and kind of twist the wing down so that it's going to lie a kilter with the wing down. So he puts that on, casts it, the fly comes down, trout comes down and takes it, right? So it's just a matter of where observation, you know, the guy that just is not really looking carefully wouldn't see it, but if you're looking carefully and trying to say, what the hell is going on? Why is what he's taking different from what's coming down? Then it becomes a simple matter.
Dan, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Just in the hopper.
Yeah.
The hopper situation, was it windy?
No.
Did you see hoppers in the water?
No.
One thing when I was a kid, and being out in Montana at
Yeah.
the time, because that's where I was born, my dad always says if we don't see them on the water, unless you've got a hopper that shows wings on it, don't fish it.
Well,
Because the only hoppers that we're getting in the water
are the one they're flying.
and getting
Right.
down.
Right. Yeah, these were adults that I caught that had wings, but I crippled them.
Those three patterns too, those three hopper patterns being sold at the local fly shop, they may have seen enough of it.
That's exactly right. They saw those patterns, you know.
Well, do they, you know, like a muskie, for example, I would bet that most of the muskie I've caught is because I anger them. I mean, I put a bait right on top of them, and the territorial flies, and they snap at it right away.
Mhm.
It's right. The trout do the same thing. Are they territorial? Is there a way that they might, you know, go after something that just is in their area?
Well, I don't know if you put like a streamer imitation and you go and put that down to where, you know, the trout is. They may hit it out of anger,
This
but
last fall, I think, when I was up in that stream, I don't think they were hitting my number 3 Mapsogea because it was a fish. I think I was dragging it over there spawning fish.
yeah,
They were like, you're protected.
Well,
Yeah.
we went up to Northwest Territories a while back, lake trout, Arctic char fishing. And the guy that was on our island gave us this buzz bait. I don't know if you ever heard of it before, but it's the first time in my life I looked at something and said, there's no way that a fish would ever, you know, go after something like this. It was like a lead, you know, looking, you know, piece that was on a treble hook at the bottom that you just jigged up and down. And every time you threw it out 100 feet of water, you caught a fish. And it was like, what the hell is this fish thinking about?
Mhm.
And why would this fish attack this? It doesn't make any sense to me. There's no animal that, you know, fish, whatever, insect, that would ever look like that, but yet this is the most popular bait. I mean, what is going through that fish's mind?
I think a lot of that is competition in sterile water, because there's not a lot of natural food for them.
Okay.
I experienced the same thing in Newfoundland, where you could throw any damn thing out there, and 9, 10, 11 inch hook drop, it looked like bluegills coming out. No, just a way to get to it. You know, and you could catch one after another forever. But it was pretty much bare in the water. There wasn't a lot of insect activity or live bait, you know, so there's no worms being washed in. It's all raw.
So they're just competing for whatever.
To stay alive, you gotta get there the fastest with the mostest.
yeah.
That was my big.
Next slide. So here's where we get to Epigenetics. So none of you have heard about epigenetics, and it used to be thought that we inherited our genes from our parents, and if it wasn't in the DNA, it wasn't going to be inherited from the parents, right? That's the traditional thinking about genetics and how characteristics are inherited from parent to child, and then from that child to the grandchild of the original parents. Okay. Now we know that the way that genetics work is that the gene has to be expressed. And there is a mechanism of how the genetic code is expressed. And the genetic code is expressed by RNA, ribonucleic acid, messenger RNA. Okay, so it's not the DNA that it encodes the RNA, which then expresses it. Okay. Now, so here's the tiny URL. So mutations take hundreds, if not thousands, of generations. How many epigenetic changes can occur in a single generation? And this is how many changes in the way a genetic code is interpreted can occur in a single generation. The genetic code doesn't change, the way it's interpreted changes, which is kind of like the underlying genetic code changes, right? If the interpretation is different, you're going to end up with a different result, right? Next slide. So this is the study that they did on the Hood River, and really the purpose of this study was to see if there were any significant changes in wild steelhead and steelhead that came from hatcheries. And steelhead fishermen will tell you, hell yes, there is, right? Wild steelhead are stronger, they fight differently, they just are better fish to catch. So they wanted to ask the question, how long does it change? How long does it take for the expression of a gene to change? How many generations of being raised in a hatchery? Okay, so yeah.
When I was out in Washington State, this was 3 years ago, we went by a hatchery in a place where they were actually pulling out some of the fish to do studies on it. And they were finding that when they released hatchery fish, they would actually had somebody doing studies with underwater cameras when spawning occurred.
Yeah.
They were finding that the wild fish didn't want to spawn with the hatchery fish, which I didn't know. How in the heck would they know the difference?
I don't know.
Genetically looking for something that's more.
Yeah.
Yeah, something was going on.
Okay.
That was turkey in Wisconsin too, right? I mean, they tried to do Penrose turkey and nothing, and then they go buy wild turkey, and now you've got turkey like every place.
So what they did was they collected wild fish, wild males, wild female fish from the Hood River. They, bred them, took those eggs, raised them in a hatchery. So that's the first generation, right? One generation raised in a hatchery. And they then took those fish that were raised in a hatchery and looked at how their genes were expressed. And they found 723 differences in genetic expression. one artificial mating, raised in a hatchery. Being raised in a hatchery changed the expression of 723 genes, which meant that these genetic changes or epigenetic changes occur very rapidly. Okay?
So, question there. If they, so they find this, you know, with
Yeah.
that first set. So, does it have, I guess, I'm just trying to wonder, does it have anything to do with how they fed those fish in those tanks and everything versus?
Yeah, the whole environment, the way they're fed, the way the water is, you know, the way that they're in a constant, the same amount of flow, you know. Yeah. So the first stages of domestication are characterized by massive heritable changes to gene expression. So next slide. So these are references to epigenetic changes. Next slide.
So I guess, do you think that then having fish hatcheries and using them to bolster the population is a good thing or a bad?
Oh, it's a bad thing if you're not needed. Yeah.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
We know,
Yeah.
like, in this area of the state,
Yeah.
the DNR in our trout waters will not stock fish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because so many of our rivers here are so self-sustaining.
Yeah.
They don't even consider it an option.
They haven't for years.
Well, that's what they talk, the lake that we have up north with walleye, same thing. They don't, it's naturally producing, and some of the people that have property are like, well, why can't we stock, and they're like, no, you don't want to screw up,
Well, they,
Good thing.
They introduced, when you stock, you have a big risk of disease
Yeah.
that carries on, and then.
Well, it sounds like that weaken the gene pool of your.
Yeah.
That's basically putting that, putting things on.
So
Like
So-
Texas,
Yeah.
they don't last.
so I asked myself the question. I don't know the answer to this. If multiple generations of fish in a natural fishery like Silver Creek in Idaho, where the fishing is super difficult, or the Henry's Fork of the Snake River, at the Railroad Ranch, where the fish are extremely difficult to catch, where there's generation of naturally fish reproduction, and they're being fished over, and they've been fished over for decades. Can the epigenetic results of that create these wild fish that are more difficult to catch? And is that one of the reasons why these fisheries are so damn hard to get fish out of, is because of epigenetics? Just a theory, right?
Does it have to be genetic, or could it be a learning? It's
Well, they can't, yeah,
behavior.
well, if they,
Bigger fishes.
well,
Well, I think there's some proof, like in dogs, they know that the genetic code from one dog to another, and I'm talking about hunting dogs, helps determine that dog's ability to scent, their ability to be trained, their ability to do the right things, as a hunter would want them, or a handler. So, and as that goes through time, if you find like people that are into hunting dogs and things like that, they follow that genetics and who the parents of those litters are quite a lot. And I know a lot of people because I'm involved with this somewhat, that will only buy certain dogs from certain people at certain times. I passed on a couple dogs about 6 years ago because they were bred by one of the parents it was a male, and I didn't think he was a good dog, and it's kind of turned out to be that I was right. But you're guessing at all this because they don't know. But if you follow people that have actually followed it, there is a little bit of science to it, but there's also a lot of knowledge that has to be recorded with each in that case, each litter and stuff like that. And that's in something where they can actually know and look at it. With fish in a natural setting, it's less scientific because they don't have all that data all the time.
Well, to try to answer your question, I don't know whether little trout watch big trout eat or, whether that is, but there's definitely that fish can pass along their experiences while they were alive through epigenetic changes in their genetic code. And they did an experiment where they took cichlids, which I guess are a type of fish, and they had the fish on one, they had a cage and there was a glass sheet in between the cichlids on one side and the other side of the tank. Okay? They introduced a predator of the cichlids in the opposite side of the tank at the same time that they introduced a chemical that could be detected by the cichlids. So they associated this chemical with the cichlids, presumably, right? And the cichlids went just crazy because here was another fish that fed on cichlids. Okay. So after they exposed these cichlids to this predator, they bred the cichlids.
The ones that were still alive.
No, the ones that were on the other side of the tank. Yeah, they weren't actually eaten, but they were on their side of this. So they bred them. They took they raised the hatchlings. They put them in like the same tank on the opposite side. They're happy. They introduced a chemical into the other side of the tank, and the water, was all one. Soon as the cichlids on that side detected the chemical, they went crazy, as if there was a predator in the tank with them, because their parents had associated the chemical with a predator, and even though the offspring had never been with the predator, they associated this chemical that was encoded epigenetically to create fear reaction in the offspring. So next. So this is, inherited memories in mice. The mice can inherit memories from the parents, inherited anxiety. Next. Okay, next. So we're going to talk about, okay. So we'll talk about selectivity here. So here's a kind of a Venn diagram. So before the hatch, the fish are feeding opportunistically, and then as they become selective, they gradually move this way, and these fish here are still feeding opportunistically. These fish here are in transition, and these fish are feeding selectively. So as selectivity goes on, this side gets smaller, this side gets larger. Next. So if we have a scale of selectivity and we put up a population density, right? So this is one population, this is another population, and this is where the population overlaps. But this is really a population that's moving over towards here. Okay, it's moving to the right. So go ahead and next.
As they get older, or?
Yeah, we're talking about selectivity here. As the population moves this way, they're becoming more selective.
But I mean, is that just a general thing, or is it as trout age?
No, I think it's just what they're because the population is got young trout, old trout, trout of all ages. So it is just the counting all of the same population, different ages, right? The larger trout would tend to be more selective. Now again, this is a theoretical thing, but as selectivity develops, the population becomes more homogeneous in that more and more fish are acting the same. Okay, and that's all this shows, is that they're becoming more alike. Okay, next. So population dynamics, population of any species demonstrate a variation in traits. This is due to differences in the individuals themselves, differences in the microenvironments, and the type of food varies with the depth and location of the individual fish. So in any watershed, the fish at the top are feeding differently than the fish in the middle, feeding differently than the fish in the bottom. So when you think about there are 5 choices in trout fishing. 5 main choices you have. Is one choice. Time of day. Where you go fishing. Location. The water depth that you fish. Top, middle, at the bottom. Okay. The fly you use. And how you fish that fly. So you have 5 of these different choices when you go fishing, and it covers, you only have those 5 choices. There aren't any others. Okay. Population dynamics. So we've talked about that. Next. Okay. Now one of the reasons I did this is because there was a guy who posted that he was a relatively new fly fisher, and he posted that, and he was from Pennsylvania, and he was fishing one of the hallowed waters of Pennsylvania, and he was fishing, and there were some older fly fishers and more accomplished fly fishers, and they were fishing to a hatch, and he said, what are you catching them on? And so, the fly fisher mentioned what was hatching and the imitation he was using, and the guy said, well, they're selective they're feeding selectively on these mayflies. And so he looked in his fly box, and he didn't have anything that looked like this. And so what he did was he put on a royal wolf, Jim Greenlee's favorite fly. And so he put on this royal wolf, and he started fishing this royal wolf, and caught a trout, took it off, fished it, caught another trout. So he caught a couple of trout, and he made the post, and he said, these guys lied to me, because they told me the fish were selective, and I caught these fish on a royal wolf. And so, these guys were lying, and they just tried to fool me because I was a new fly fisher. And I said, no, they weren't trying to fool you. You just don't understand population. You're such a beginner. You don't understand trout populations and variations in trout populations. And so, this is a strategy, right? The hatch breaker strategy, where if you're in a hatch and you don't have, the right fly, you try to fish a fly like a attractor, to see if there are fish that are feeding more opportunistically and aren't feeding selectively. or you can fish at a different depth or location, or you can fish at a different time, or you can move, right? If you're in a location where they're feeding. So you've got those 5 choices. Next. So this brings me to, what are we actually doing when we fly fish?
I'm pulling my flies out of the tree.
No, what are we actually doing?
Training.
Well, and yeah, possibly. Next.
It's like you'll sing, it's a jerk on one end of the line, waiting for a jerk on the other.
Okay. Well, in my, what I'm telling you is we're performing an experiment. That's really what we're doing. We're performing an experiment on the trout population. Next. We're doing a population survey. We are surveying or sampling the population for the fish that are susceptible to the flies and the methods that we are using. We know there are trout there. We're using a fly, we're using a specific method to see if there are trout in that location that are susceptible to the method we're using. For example, okay, if we put a magnet on the end of our line and we dragged it over a bunch of objects, we only catch something that's made out of steel or iron, right? Because those are the only things that are attracted to the magnet. Well, that's basically what we're doing when we're fly fishing. We're doing a population survey. Like the magnet, we only catch the fish who are susceptible to the fly and technique that we're using. Okay, and so that's what you're going to think. It's not that when you're not catching fish, there may not be trout there, but likely there are. They just aren't susceptible to what the technique that you're using. Next. So what this guy did was he made the mistake of assuming that his results represent behavior of all the trout and or fish, including those who have not taken his fly. Right? When somebody asks you, what are they feeding on? And you say, well, they're feeding on fly XYZ, you're basically implying that all the trout can be caught with that fly. And that's really not the situation. What we're saying in reality is some of those fish can be caught with that fly, right? And yet when a fly fisher asks what we're using, what we're catching the trout on, and we give him an answer, what he assumes is that all the fish can be caught with the fly that we're telling him that we caught our trout with. Next. So that's an assumption. Now, have you ever heard somebody say that trout ignore the hook? You ever heard anybody say that? Because I have. That we're catching these fish because the trout are ignore the hook. They can see the hook on a fly. They say the trout ignore the hook. Or there was a hatch, I caught fish on an attractor, and therefore the trout were not selective. That's another, statement that some fly fishers would make. Next. So, those are illogical statements. They really don't match up with reality. They say all trout ignore the hook because we catch trout even though the hook is. The reality is the only thing we can say is that some fish, the fish we caught, ignore the hook, right? That is what a scientist would say. So theoretically, operant conditioning could condition some trout to avoid hooks and therefore some flies where the hook is highly visible. That's a theoretical possibility. Right, next. Next. Oh, that's, hold on. So the logical fallacy is the biased sample. It's called hasty generalization. So be careful not to go from a specific case to generalize. Next. So whenever you come up with a theory, and so that's you got to judge my talk by these two rules, and these are two truth tests. Okay, philosophically, these are true tests of truth. The coherence test is the theory internally consistent. In other words, does the theory make sense? Does it all match up? And the correspondence test, you can have a theory that all the parts match up, but does the theory correspond to reality? Does it explain the events that happen when we fly fish? Okay, so that's how you guys should judge, this talk. Some of it is based on real science. Some of it is I'm making some judgment decisions. Next. Okay, so that's hopefully I've covered almost everything, and we've asked questions during the talk. Are there any other questions that I may not be able to answer?
I think you should add something else to your title, selectivity. You should say selectivity and the apple does not fall far from the tree.
The apple does not fall far from the tree.
All that genetic stuff,
Oh,
when you think about it, I mean, it all makes a lot of sense to me,
yeah.
but it's still confusing because it doesn't explain everything.
No.
But see, I could just take the other side of that argument. I've seen families, you can talk about, our kids. And I've seen kids where everyone is the same. They all wrestle, they all play basketball, they all do whatever. And then you look, my family, I have 4 kids. They couldn't be any more different. They all have their strengths. They all pick different things to excel in, and none of them are anywhere close in their interests or the way that they ended up. And, they're all successful in their own different ways. So like your example of, breeding dogs, I mean, shit, my 4 kids would come out and you'd have one that would excel at one thing, one would excel at something completely, I mean, we had sports, we had academics, we had plays, we had music, we had all different things that they selected. So I just don't see the.
I get that because my kids are the same. They're all successful in what they do, and they're doing completely different things.
Right. So I mean, how can we?
But my example about the dogs was talking about how people select the dog.
Right.
Selected breeding.
When they go to purchase a dog from somebody who's providing the dog.
Right.
And that was that they looked at the breeding, and those breeding patterns, for the most part, probably 90% of the time with that animal, they follow that pattern. It doesn't mean they're perfect, because a dog has to be trained, and not all people spend the time to train the dog the same way. But
That's what I was.
what I can tell you is that when I've seen dogs that are not trained properly, and then the owner wants to breed them, and when they breed them, the puppies that come out of there 2 years later still aren't reacting the way that somebody else who picked another dog from that same litter but trained it differently. All that training to me reminds me of what he talked about, and what the epigenetics and everything and what's learned. That keeps going and going and going. The one that wasn't successful and didn't train properly, those dogs are never really successful. It's interesting how this goes, and I think it's our environment, with your own children and things like that. Maybe your home environment determines how they're going to be or what they're going to do.
I think they all look to shine. Okay, so when you have a kid who maybe is first and they shine at something, whatever it might be, the next kid along can't do better than that. So they pick something else to be the best at. And then the third one comes along and has 2 that they can't meet up to. So they pick a new area to be, excel at. I guess if you're gonna train them all to be alike, then you're gonna get them all alike. They may not be their best suit for how they were made, okay, to excel in life, but I get it. I mean, I see both sides. I see, like I said,
Well,
I've seen kids that have been raised the same and they end up being 4-state champ wrestlers. And then you see families where, they all pick something different to excel in. And, so I guess I'm just not all into the, genetics, we're all the same, dad and mom, and all of us are going to be, NFL football players or wrestlers or
Well-
scientists or whatever. I mean, it just doesn't,
Well, let me respond or make a comment. What you're really talking about is nature versus nurture,
right.
right? And that's and it's a combination of both nature and nurture, right?
But I mean, we didn't like, try to make them all different.
No.
They chose because they all wanted attention. And how do you get attention? You be the best at whatever you can be the best at. If your brother's gonna be a really good athlete, are you gonna try to follow in his footsteps if you're not gonna be up to his, level?
But nurture is the environment that they're in, and part of the nurturing is not necessarily the parents, but also the siblings,
Common thread, the genetic aspect of it, they excel in everything they do.
Well, I mean, it's 50-50 is the way I've always looked at it, but I mean, I just am amazed at how many families I see where the kids aren't anything alike, and some where they are, and it's like, well, were they raised differently? I don't think so. I mean,
Bob, you were-
My 3 kids have in common is they like pizza and stouts and porters.
right.
Bob, you were going to make a comment?
Well, I was just wondering if much of your presentation applies more to certain species of trout than others. For instance,
You mean Brown versus Brook and that?
yeah, for instance, I'm thinking that this concept that if a trout sees a certain fly long enough, they won't feed on it, they won't go after it. But years ago, when
If they get caught, by the, it's not that they don't see it, but they get punished for taking it.
But
Right, there's got to be that punishment. So it's not only seeing it, it's the negative, or it's a positive punishment side of the, you can call it negative reinforcement. Most people call it negative reinforcement. It's really positive punishment. They get punished for doing it. If they see it and they don't get punished,
I'm thinking the heyday of Buffalo Ford with the cutthroat fishery on the
Right.
Yellowstone River.
right?
You could catch fish after fish after fish on that same caddis emerger if you were in the right place in the right slot where they were feeding. I even caught one. I didn't, the hook didn't even touch the fish I caught. It hooked another caddis emerger fly that had had in its mouth, and the hook caught the fly. So that tells me that fish wasn't too damn smart. They
Well,
went after the same
let's see
thing.
that the alternative explanation to that is that there are so many fish at Buffalo Ford that there could be fish that did get caught and aren't taking that fly, but because there's so many fish, there's another one
Competition for food,
there.
yeah.
Well, they're
Yeah.
more opportunistic if there's competition.
Yeah.
So therefore, that's why that's working. But like Henry said, the last one to me was that you take a small sample and you call that the Bible, you're really not thinking correctly because your small sample is way too small.
What do you mean it's small?
Well, you go out fishing one day and say, he talked about the royal wolf thing. It's kind of funny because I fished the Eau Claire, the east branch of the Eau Claire somewhat. I've learned over the years that certain times of the year, in the summer, especially when it gets a little warmer, anything with red on it works. It's like magic. It doesn't match a hatch. It doesn't do this or anything else like that. It just works.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but does that mean?
I'm
Does that mean that every time I go there, I should put a royal wolf on as an example?
No.
Most of the other times I don't. It's just certain times. I've learned that from my experience, and what he's saying is fish basically do the same thing. But if you take my experience and you take that as gospel and you go at the wrong time of the year, you're not going to catch anything.
Let's just face it, it's all luck.
Well, they're looking for,
That's why fishermen ask you, do you
certain
have any
food
luck?
organisms that different
Humans
times
don't
of year.
think straight.
Hell, you know, you see that out on the Plover and,
But none of us are. I mean, we make the same mistakes over and over.
Um,
You should do
Get the fish out there during that hatch.
Yeah, well,
Speaking of that, Henry, I'm gonna go fish, I get the privilege of fishing the driftless next week, for the whole week, so what fly do you think I can find?
I have no idea. I don't fish the driftless, so.
It's pink squirrels.
Oh, pink squirrel, yeah.
The whole thing is, you don't go there unless you got.
You gotta have some pink squirrels.
So now, after hearing what you said, I'm a little disappointed I spent that much time tying those bloody things.
Good work.
Where are you going?
What? He's going down to the driftless.
Oh, they work, that's like a term down there.
What?
Thanks, squirrel.
So they're dumber fish, they don't.
I don't know.
Well, yeah, my
They're
thing,
smart.
this
They take 'em.
whole, your whole talk on this.
It's gotta look
Yeah,
like
really
something
what
that's
we
in
need
the,
is the
in the
genetics
river.
of fish to get dumber and dumber.
Probably a caddis,
And
or
it's got-
goose or something like that, but hell, they work, I know they do.
Yeah.
My son fishes at the lot, that's his favorite fly down there.
I'm feeling better, but thank you.
Well, that's why I'm here to make.
I
you
use
feel
them, I
better.
catch anything.
I was fishing, up above Buffalo Ford, on the Yellowstone, and one night, and I knew what was hatching because I have a little net, and I caught the natural, and so I was pretty sure I had the perfect imitation. And what I do to choose the tippet size is I divide the size of the fly by 3. So it was a size, I think it was a size 14, and so I put on a 5X tippet, and drifted down, and drifted downstream, and I was certain I got a drag-free drift, but fish refused it. So I lengthened. Pretty soon I got to be about 3 feet of 5X tippet, and they wouldn't take it, and so I was frustrated, and so and I happened to go to the Blue Ribbon Flies the next day, and Jurassic was there. Jurassic, or however you pronounce his name, was one of the owners of, and he wrote a book along with Craig Matthews on the flies of the Yellowstone River. So I told him, where I was fishing and stuff, and he says, "Oh, I was just downstream from you fishing," and he said I had a great time. And I go, "Well, I said, well, how were you catching them?" And he said, "Well, I used about 6 feet of 6X tippet." And I said, "Well, I used about 5 feet of 5X." And he said, "Well, that's what you did wrong. You just needed to go down, one size in tippet size, that they were so keened in to drag that just, the fly was still dragging a little bit because of the size of the tippet. So you always learn.
Work for you though is when you get a really nice big fish on and all of a sudden you snap.
I'd rather hook the fish and lose it though, than not hook anything.
That's just a chance you have to take.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, I experienced the same thing in Arkansas, both tailwater,
Yeah.
Juan River. I mean, unless you had like a 6X That's what I'm
Talking about Buffalo Ford, I don't know if you were there when I was talking to a guy who was well,